All right. And I have the questions here. So the first one, as you know, is you telling a bit briefly about how you ended up engaging in these matters with economic, sustainable questions.
Yeah, well, so I started studying economics, but also political economy and history of economic thought and all of these sort of things because I really felt like the economic system stands at the center of a lot of our other systems and the importance of transforming that to like really ripple out. But I really didn't resonate with the ideas that you learn in economics, a lot of the assumptions that are embedded within it around like who we are, why, the ways in which we like what motivates us to provide for one another, the assumptions around the environment, and many, many more. And so for me, I went through quite a journey of trying to find like heterodox economic thinkers, new ways of conceptualizing of the economy. But then ultimately, for me, it's always been about changing the economy, not just understanding it. And so that led me very much into economic policy and specifically industrial policy, because it's sort of this way that governments are meant to more strategically intervene in the economic system to encourage and reward certain kinds of economic activities relative to others, which sounds obvious in some way that you would want to do that to like achieve your goals, whatever development goals they are, whether or not that's diversification or, inequality reduction, sustainability. But the mainstream economic thinking is still that the government's just supposed to create like an enabling environment for the economy and not intervene too much. And so I worked for the UN for quite a long time as an industrial policy expert in like trade policy, structural transformation, because I really wanted to support countries to break out of these like neo-colonial trading patterns that really keep them locked into low value added production of raw materials or agricultural products, and then having to just be really import dependent. And in working in that space for different international development agencies, just like constantly you would have these policy documents that were, first of all, rarely written by the governments themselves, but were written by like McKinsey or Ernst & Young or these different sort of economic experts or consultants that always started with the implicit assumption of growth and then looked pretty much the same in terms of you just need more skills and tech and finance, and all of that needs to come from outside. And there's just like one size fits all economic thinking and economic policy making. And so I then really was passionate about building tools and processes that are more about facilitating policy design as opposed to dictating policy, if that makes sense, rather than saying these are the policies you need, like how can we go about being clear on what kind of development goals you have and then what kind of changes in the economy are needed in order to support that, right? And so if a country wants resiliency, for example, then, just that export-oriented development model doesn't make sense, right? Because you're going to specialize in a very particular kind of sector and you might want to intervene in a more strategic way. And so just asking the questions of what you're really trying to achieve and why led me very much to the Wellbeing Economy movement and to WEAll, which is where I now work as their economics and policy lead. Because first of all, this was like this amazing community of thinkers, but also of practitioners and organizations and like change makers, activists that were really passionate about economic systems change, but also, yeah.
I was already eager to ask a question that's not on the paper, and that is, what have you learned regarding your experience and work about political capture?
Yeah, so I mean, for me personally, especially working with like lower and middle income like countries and the majority world, the thing that you become very clear about is that multinational corporations control our global economic system and are governing our global economic system. And every government is just trying to compete against one another to attract or appease these giants, right? And so we have a system now where nearly every sector in the world is now controlled by less than a handful of corporations. And we have these global legal instruments like, I don't know if you're familiar with the ISDS, like the Investor State Dispute Settlement System. It is Okay, so it sounds like it would be super boring, and I think that's intentional because it's a clause that is written into hundreds, like all of the trade agreements and bilateral investment agreements that allow for multinational corporations to sue governments for the right to impose any policy that might infringe on their profits, right? So, Ecuador, for example, got sued for the right to not drill in the Amazon. And they had to pay the equivalent of their entire health budget for the right not to do that because they had signed on to these agreements, right? And so this is huge, and it makes you realize that we have this global economic architecture that is working in service of multinational corporations that could be used to actually hold them accountable, but we're not using it that way, right? Instead, we're constantly having to just pay for the right to actually try to govern our own economic systems. And so for me, that political capture is something that's very prevalent and very clear, working in international development and the sort of the limited policy space that a lot of governments even have for sort of economic self-determination, let alone the people, right, and the communities that are really trying to just have a voice over their livelihoods. And so, yeah, that's an area where, yeah, I saw it a lot.
A Swedish energy government company, they sued Germany for they had made lots of investment in coal. So when Germany changes their laws and want to get away from coal, we sued them.
Yeah.
And that was a government company.
Yeah.
Based on these
Absolutely.
triggers.
Yeah, Canada also got sued for just complying with the Basel Convention of prohibiting the export of toxic chemicals. They had to reverse it and then also apologize publicly for it and pay for it. You know what I mean? And so this is, it's all over the place and the implications of that. So
this is a broader question. So what is and what could an economy be? What is an economy?
So the way I describe an economy is it's just the way we produce and provide for one another. So it's a flow, it's an activity, a means by which we improve our quality of life.
So lots of things that we know associate with economy isn't necessarily part of an economy.
Yeah. I think oftentimes we think that it's money, right? So it's only any aspect of our lives that there is money circulating as a part of it. But there are so many aspects of the ways that we provide for one another that are non-monetized, right? And that are based on caregiving, and particularly what's provided by our natural environment freely, right? And as a gift. And the fact that that is really the source of absolutely everything that we end up producing and providing for one another, and recognizing that it's a system of reciprocal exchange, and a beautiful, actually, in some ways, network of reciprocal exchange between billions of people around the world that requires a lot of cooperation and trust. But ultimately, we're not giving back as much as we're taking, right, to the natural environment or to one another. And that's created a really imbalanced economic system.
What should an economy be in a more sustainable society?
So at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, at least at WEAll, we really talk about these 5 WEAll needs. And so it's really about evaluating the economy and designing the economy in terms of its capacity to deliver on those needs. And first and foremost, it's about dignity. So how does the economy provide everyone with the foundations that they need to live a safe and secure and happy life, right? And with that foundation, also recognizing our fundamental need for an interconnection with nature. And so does the economy actively protect and regenerate and cherish our natural environment and all of the species that we are a part of in this ecosystem? And then the third we talk about is around purpose. Yeah, and that's really, I think, at the heart of a lot of this is what is the purpose, right, of the economy? Like, what are we really trying to achieve? And so if we begin with the idea of it's about our people and planet's well-being, then how do we really assign value and evaluate economic activities or behaviors by their contribution to social and ecological well-being? And then the fourth area is about fairness. Yeah, so really having justice at the heart of the economy and building an economic system that ensures that there's a fair distribution of not only income and wealth, but critically time and power as well, right? And so building a pre-distributive economy that can ensure that it's equitable from the get-go, as opposed to always waiting for the government after the fact to come in and try to redistribute to fix those sort of damages. And then the final one, which I think is really, really critical, is participation. And so it really is about building economies that are locally rooted and a reflection of our unique cultures and contexts, geographies, and histories, and also that is molded and directed by our voices and by our active participation, whilst being connected globally and recognizing that we are also, one species on a shared planet.
So what can we keep and what needs to be replaced with something better for our current economic system?
Yeah. I mean, so for me, referencing the point around participation is really important, because I also think, although we have this concept of, the 5 WEAll needs, the process of people also being engaged in the discussion of really outlining what they feel is really matters for all species to really flourish, on this planet as a starting point, right? What really matters for our well-being now and for generations to come, and to have that dialogue and to really identify those dimensions of life and those areas of life that are so important for both people and planet is really like that starting point, right? And the reason why I say this is because although often you get similar kinds of dimensions of things that matter around like social connections and, time and creativity and health and, like a lot of these sort of ideas, when you start with those and then that has to become the framework for then looking at your particular society and taking a strength-based approach of saying, okay, well, what are the ways in which we're already producing and providing things in line with those goals? What are the good examples of where we see a lot of social connection coming from the ways in which we're co-creating things together, or the ways in which we're providing things for one another? Where do we see really good examples of where certain kinds of goods we're producing are really essential for our health and for, the prosperity of a particular community? Because then that becomes the starting point, right, to envision an economic system which is actually more of what you really want, right, and that you already have, and really thinking about how do you encourage and reward the growth of that relative to the aspects that might be detrimental and problematic, right? And I say this because I think one of my major issues with like contemporary mainstream economic thinking is this one-size-fits-all approach, right? This belief that across space and time, all economies are fundamentally the same. Because in different cultures and contexts, I do think that you will have different kinds of relationships, organizational systems, business systems, like cultural sort of models that can be the foundations for what you want more of. And then you also will then also recognize that, let's say, it's clear that, I don't know, what's one that, like oil and gas is a problematic, like kind of economic activity, because it's taking from the earth and not like a non-renewable resource that cannot be given back, right? And so how do we then, remove ourselves from those kind of activities whilst also building sustainable mechanisms for energy, right? And where are we seeing those kind of sustainable mechanisms within our own societies, and what's necessary to ensure that it's balanced, I guess, right? Because every action, there's going to be an equal and inverse reaction. So anytime you're generating any energy, it means you're also going to have to give back to the source of that too, to ensure its sustainability.
So it sounds to me that when it comes to participation, that democracy could also be something that is important even in production, which is kind of excluded now, and also in when we, of course, in more ordinary, regular democratic processes, that we can make decisions on what resources to use now and what resources we save for later.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I believe very strongly in the need for greater democratic governance of our economy, right? And of economic decision making and strategy design and policy making. And that's why, for me, a lot of my passion is around trying to demystify the economy and really making it clear that, like, we are the economy, you have a right and a responsibility to have an opinion on it, right? And you should be engaged in these sort of decision-making processes, because so often it's riddled with a lot of jargon and a lot of really complex ideas that can feel really intimidating and therefore as if it's beyond the scope of influence. And so once we have, that foundation of feeling like, okay, well, I should have an opinion on this, then therefore we have that sort of foundation for mobilizing. Because I do think it's going to require a movement, a real social movement of people to transform the system. And it's not going to be like the neoliberals, like a elite academic top-down, like technocratic kind of transformation that's really going to save us. And so ensuring that the process by which we build this system is in line with the kind of system we want in the end is really critical.
So maybe I go to this that you have written yourself, or what was your role in these 7 pathways, 7 ideas for each? Is it your?
Yeah. I wrote it before actually I worked for WEAll. Yeah, so it's a paper which when WEAll started, I was just a volunteer, like a member, and I was working at the African Development Bank actually, and they asked if I would, for ahead of one of the G7 conferences, like put together a little proposal of different policies that would feel important at the global level for that. And so it's one of the papers that I'm the sole author of, because now having come in and being the economics policy lead and doing a lot of the knowledge creation, because we're an alliance and a membership-based organization, any of the new products, I try to get our membership to co-create together, because I think that's a whole point of the process as well, to get people to connect through the process of generating and making accessible that knowledge and those ideas. But I mean, I can talk a little bit, especially if you do want to talk about like the global economic system, about that sort of proposal. But I also think, especially if you want to talk about some of the policy stuff, also our policy design guide that we co-created with the membership is a good sort of example of practical actions and processes that can be taken to try to transform the system. Maybe I'll start a little bit with the policy design process, because it is, even right now at Stockholm Plus 50, it's incredible that the Secretary General in his opening remarks said, we need to move beyond GDP, need to really start assessing our progress in terms of our well-being and for people and planet, and like having that level of awareness is really exciting and important. And I do think within this movement there is a lot of emphasis on like indicators and how do we develop new metrics of progress, but a lot of governments are stuck there. Also, if they develop a lot of multidimensional indicators around the environment and society and the economy, how do you then deal with those and actually develop different sorts of strategies and policies? And so in looking, when I came into this role, we have so many different members who have incredible economic models or strategies or policy proposals, but what seemed to be missing was the how. Not the what policies, but how do you actually go about like identifying and designing those. And so this is really about that process, that democratic process of really engaging people first and foremost in that discussion of what matters for well-being, to co-create a vision, an alternative vision of progress, like Buen Vivir, for example, right? Which I think is a really beautiful example of utilizing indigenous wisdom to have a notion of prosperity that is living in harmony with oneself and with one's community and with one's natural environment, and then sharing that vision through music and art and culture, as well as through government, and having that become a new narrative for progress that is actually embedded within the culture, not just within some government framework, right? That is not actually percolating down into the society at large. And then comes the actual measurement, right? About how do we know if we're making progress in terms that vision. And then those indicators are important. But the next step is really where there's still a lot of space and need for innovation. We're trying to help with thinking about how do we actually build a transformative strategy for the economy. And that first and foremost starts with how do you align institutions and stakeholders, yeah? And so getting them to move beyond silos to really recognizing the interconnectivity between all of these various agencies within government, but also stakeholders at large, right? So the business community and the civil society community and, and all of these different areas. And that, we have some really good examples of where you're trying to see that harmonization. And so Sophie Howe yesterday was speaking from the government of Wales, and I really love their well-being framework because it's not just, okay, these are our 7 well-being goals of we want to be more resilient Wales, a more globally responsible Wales, etc. But they have critically these 5 ways of working, and one of them is all about integration and holding accountable any ministry to actually consider the other goals anytime they're co-creating these policies, and also participation of citizens' active engagement in those decision making, taking a longer term perspective, and not just always putting out fires, as it were. And so and then from there it's a lot about, okay, how do we, with that vision of progress, actually downgrade the economy and view it as a driver of our prosperity as opposed to the definition of our prosperity, right? And so identifying, as we were saying earlier, what are those areas of economic life that are really beneficial for our well-being, and then to more strategically protect and promote them accordingly. And so I think I don't know if I mentioned this during the event, but I think COVID is a really good example of our capacity to do that, just our intuitive understanding of which kind of economic activities are really essential, at least for maintaining current well-being. We need to use that same sort of intuitive thinking to think about, okay, well, what are those areas of the economy that are actually contributing to protecting and revitalizing the natural environment, right? And really then focusing energies on encouraging and rewarding those relative to the ones that are damaging. And so that, again, seems kind of intuitive, but actually this is where a lot of governments get stuck, because they're still trying to hold the economy the same level as society and the environment, and they're not commensurate, right? In the sense that it's the environment, and we're one species of many, and then within our species, we have a system we call the economy. And so it needs to be sort of viewed accordingly.
And are they also stuck because they are, or maybe it's not, that they're dependent on these multinational corporations, or are that more an illusion that you can get away from if you start building things resiliently locally? Or?
I mean, I think it's always going to be a multi-level process, right? And so you need to have the grassroots, movement and examples and local transformations. But I do think that there's a very real constraint to how much any local community or national entity can really meaningfully transform the economy, because we're so globally interconnected, right? And all of our production systems and consumption systems are really interwoven with one another in a way that requires a certain level of global economic reform, even to just make space for self-determination. And so multinational corporations are definitely a big player in this, because they are making the rules at the moment. We allowed for globalization to really outpace the development of our global governance institutions. And so we're still acting as if nation states mattered in terms of economies, to be honest, which they don't a lot of the time. And so having mechanisms. So for me, for example, I really believe in global competition legislation. You just need to break it up. They're too big. We've allowed them to merge too much, and it's just from a power perspective, but also even in terms of a sustainability perspective, you can't be producing at that level and think it's going to be sustainable. And so having a system of really small and medium-sized enterprises will be a lot more sustainable than having, a few giant conglomerates that are just controlling all of our different sort of systems and processes. And so to make space for more of that like sort of creative thinking. And I think there's also a real need for reform in terms of like intellectual property rights. So this is like an area where it's a fairly new development, but one of the things that has always connected us around the globe is the sharing of knowledge, right? And the transmission of knowledge. And we have somehow created a system to say that like knowledge is something you can own, which is very, and it's only mine to have, even though it's obviously clearly a part of just the collective subconscious. It's part of like, it's permeable. And so what is this has done really practically in terms of development has just meant that, a lot of communities aren't allowed to even use the kind of production processes or mechanisms that would help them to, innovate or, like really like learn from best practice. And I mean, obviously we've seen this with COVID and the vaccine, right? Like the fact that a couple of companies have the patents means that the majority of the world doesn't get the vaccine. And so these sort of systems have to be reformed in order to allow for us to collectively govern the things that do connect us across space.
Can you say something about how do you think that financial sector needs to change?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So I must be honest, first of all, that it's like my background is a lot more in the real economy, right? Like, so the ways in which like labor and production and trade and things that are real to the ways in which we provide for one another. But the reality is that the global financial system is what is controlling, like more than any other, I think, aspect, the real like growth dependencies, the maintenance of like so many of these inequalities. So we've created a system where it's so much easier to make money off of money than it is off of work, and actually producing something of value. And that has created a very, very problematic dynamic of a few people being able to concentrate more and more of that wealth, because by the sheer fact that they have it to begin with, it just sits in the stock market and it just continues to accumulate, which is why we have had such a growth in billionaires. So I don't know, there's a recent Oxfam report came out that shows that 10 billionaires doubled their wealth during the pandemic, while 99% of the humanity was left worse off. And this is also showing that this is not we're all growing and some people are accumulating more. It's like, no, some people are making more at the expense of everyone else. And that is because of a system that is being really led by the financial markets relative to our work, right? And our work and the ways in which we, provide for one another. I mean, tax havens is a huge, huge issue, of course. And for me, I think it's really about also creating a binding code of conduct for multinational corporations broadly, right? So in order to stop this race to the bottom where, the majority of governments I worked with would create these export processing zones, these special economic zones, where already they have really low labor standards and environmental standards, but they want even lower ones. They want to be able to go to a special area where they don't have to pay any taxes, and it might actually get subsidized for even like gracing the country with their presence, right? And they can abide by minimal to no environmental or labor standards within those areas. And so this race to the bottom, the only way to stop it is to say that no matter where a multinational corporation goes, they have to abide by the same higher tax, labor, and environmental standards, because ultimately they can afford it, right? But right now we are allowing for the largest, most profitable companies to have the lowest standards relative to small shops and producers and domestic firms and farmers, and and so it's so unfair. And we call it like, oh, this is a free market, it's so competitive, but it's like, no, it's a rigged system. And so the tax harmonization is a huge part of that, right? Along with the labor and environmental regulations. I am actually quite hopeful a little bit around the tax part, because a big thing that has come out of like Secretary Yellen from the United States really proposed this like global corporate tax standard of 15%. And the fact that they've gotten all of the countries to sign on, even including China, there's a couple who haven't, but they're like, you know, smaller in terms of like geopolitical kind of influence, is huge. That's really, really huge. So that means that all of these tax loopholes that because, you know, certain kinds of jurisdictions have a 2% here and then 5% here and whatever, that's going to become standardized. And I do think that that's going to be huge for tax revenue generation for different countries, and is a positive sign for us moving and starting to think about what are the legal mechanisms we need to actually enforce this, and that also then serve as a foundation for a lot more progressive kind of global economic regulation of these actors and of, you know, our global economic system as a whole.
I think we all want to keep this level of technology that we're living in now. But I'm a bit worried that that won't be possible in the future because there will be a lack of materials. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, so I should also say this is purely my thing also, but I'm a bit of a Luddite. I'm like kind of skeptical of technology. I think it's really overhyped in terms of how much it's actually helping humanity relative to its like pretty detrimental consequences for our cultures and our mental health and a lot of other sort of aspects. Now, with that being said, love Google Maps, right? Like Zoom is fantastic. Really grateful to be able to like travel even here and to connect with people globally. And so there are parts of it that are important. I think there's two parts here to your question. And one is, first of all, the planned obsolescence of technological development right now is one of the major issues. So the fastest growing manufacturing sector for trade is actually electronic waste. Yeah, so I think the average lifespan of a phone now is only something like 16 months. Yeah, so it's like purposefully manufacturing these technological products to break so that you will buy a new one, and building a culture that wants to upgrade their phone every year or two or things like this is leading to a huge amount of like wasted resources. So there's like that design side where actually requiring durability and quality and repair, but as well as circularity of not constantly getting new resources and building it, like tapping into, you know, more mines and things and utilizing the resources that we already have taken as a part of it. But I also think there's like a deeper point to your question as well, which is around resource scarcity, right? And it's something I think about quite a bit because we often talk about planetary boundaries. And I know that this makes a lot of sense, I think, particularly in Western cultures as a way to create a sense of urgency and like this idea like, you know, there's only so much and we need to like live within it. But I think it can often present the environment as a constraint as opposed to the source of everything. Yeah, like it's the source of all life. And there's something really incredible about the environment in terms of its capacity to create, yeah, and to constantly reproduce. And there are, of course, some non-renewable resources that we shouldn't be using then, yeah, except for like emergencies, as it were. But there are a lot of renewable resources that we also need to utilize our time to regenerate, yeah, and to protect, because I think where we're at now, we'll realize that like even just cleaning water, yeah, this is not an expenditure. This is not just like spending money on nothing, because ultimately it means that people don't have to buy bottled water, right? It's like it actually is something that is really important for achieving and generating income if we think of income in a wider lens of the things we need to survive, right? And the ability to get those things freely. Then those types of investments actually come back like in like really exponential ways, I think. And so it's just shifting that mindset a little bit.
So this was a term that came up actually when I was continuing Malin.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted it to be explained a little bit more because I couldn't quite grasp the thing. And it was that you used this term in WEAll, and I think maybe it's in the policy design guide, or I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But this to have a society license to operate for companies. Can you tell me a little bit about that, what that would entail?
Yeah. I mean, so it's not necessarily like a term like I use very much. Yeah, so I also have to be, I should be honest that I'm not like an expert on this, but generally what it means is that within any sort of society, or like let's say community, you need to, the community needs to be able to have the power to say whether or not a certain kind of production, like practice, industry, or business is acceptable or not, and why. Yeah, and so that's pretty much just the basic point of it. And so in some ways, it's again like about democracy, and about like having the power to say what kind of industries or activities you want in a particular space, and then being able to sort of have the power to enforce that within your community.
So that means that, for instance, if you're affected by a mine where you live, you are supposed to have an influence over this.
And you can say it should go away. So in Vermont, for example, we have this Act 250, which we developed in the 70s, which is a pretty like strong environmental protection legislation around like infrastructure development and things. And it gives every town the right to say whether or not they want like business to come and be set up, purely based on if they think it'll be good for like the aesthetics or the culture or whatever, and so that's an example of like your sort of right license to operate within a particular society.
And if they say yes, are they then able to get some kind of compensation for the impact it has on the environment, for instance?
I mean, not within this, like the particular legislation that I'm talking about, but I do think that that's also where, Jennifer Hinton's ideas are really incredible and really important to this space of having different, the current narrative is that, oh, well, a business will create jobs. Yeah. And so that's really all, like the most that it kind of is meant to contribute to a society. And that's pretty much it. And I mean, also some tax revenue for the government, right? And so like that's kind of the expectation of business in terms of what they're going to give back. And so holding this idea that, ultimately businesses are just a group of people producing something together or providing something together, you know what I mean? Like doing some sort of good or service together, I think helps us to also recognize that they are a part, right, of this just society. And so therefore their contribution and what they're contributing to society is beyond just the particular good or service as well. It's part of feeling like you have a responsibility to that community as a whole, and what is your role within it, and recognizing when there are needs and gaps that, giving back particularly to the natural environment because you're in that space as really critical.
Are you by chance familiar with participatory economy? You are?
Yeah.
All right, so what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think...
It's kind of bold.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Well, I mean, I don't think so, but I'm quite radical, you know what I mean? In the sense that I feel like that's the whole point. Like if we are the economy, then we should be the ones who are governing and dictating its like shape and form, right? And so having participatory mechanisms by which we are actively determining, right, the ways in which we are going to transform the system is absolutely vital, not only within a workplace, but within like the economy as a system and as a whole. And that does need to happen at all of the various levels, right? And so even when we talk about these like global systemic reforms that are needed, we have to create new participatory mechanisms by which to like build those governance systems, because right now, by only including governments, you're not actually ensuring that all people's voices are really being heard and reflected in these decisions.
And are you talking now about participatory economy in the meaning of that it also wants to maybe replace the market with participatory planning?
I think for me, I've thought about this a lot actually, in the sense that, like, what is the market? Yeah, like it's utilized as a very powerful conceptual term, particularly for like neoclassical economists. But it's kind of fuzzy in terms of what it actually is, honestly, right? Are we talking about a farmer's market, Amazon, you know what I mean? Financial markets, like those are all markets, but ultimately they're clearly have a very different sort of feel and shape and form about them. You can imagine...
Labor market is
Yeah.
kind of... And in history we have also slave market.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, I think Amartya, and so I came also from like Karl Polanyi. I don't know if you know him, but he's like all of this idea of the market society and, you know, like really this market sort of fetishism that has controlled the evolution of a lot of our economic thinking, at least in governance. But Amartya Sen made a good point that like to be against markets is like being against conversation. Yeah, so it's like ultimately when you're talking about a market, all you're talking about is times in which people and spaces where people come to exchange things. And the principles and the rules and the purpose of that will vary very much, right? Depending on what your ultimate goals are. But so a market in and of itself, I don't think is necessarily the problem. But I think the point what you're saying is that the active participation of people dictating what are the norms and the rules and the aims of that exchange with one another is critical, right, for ensuring that you're building systems of reciprocal exchange that are balanced and inclusive and fair and sustainable and like rooted in different kinds of values than the ones that are currently dominating the market, which is very like, I want to try to get more out of this exchange than you, always, right? That's the profit motive. It's just like, how can I make you pay more than this is worth, or like try to, you know, and so I think that as a value is important. And when you have broad-based participation, and I'm an idealist, obviously, but I think that people will naturally, I think, want to have more fair and just values for what governs those exchanges. Like the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, or WEAll, was started about 4 years ago now. And it was very much about recognizing, and it was originally a group of a lot of like new economic thinkers that were working in, you know, donut economics or regenerative economy or circular economy, degrowth, post-growth, like a lot of these different conceptual ideas, and who recognized that there was more that unites us than divides us, right, in terms of our vision for a different system. But that if we're really going to build this alternative paradigm and mainstream it, then it's really important that there's more like collaboration, but also inclusion of organizations that are working in these spaces, of like policymakers, of businesses that like believe in the need for this sort of system change, and to make accessible sort of these ideas and initiatives so that people can recognize that different economic systems not only possible, but like already underway, right? Like, and it's something that's like really desirable and achievable. And so with this sort of aim, they chose the term wellbeing economy because it just felt a little bit more descriptive than new economy, right? And then more directional. It's like, okay, we want an economy for what though, right? And well-being, and also critically the term economy as opposed to economics, because economics is like the study of a certain, you know, whereas the economy is just this aspect of life on the planet. And so it's meant to be an umbrella term that encompasses a wide range of different theories, initiatives, practical policies, you know, of things that are viewed as part of this new paradigm. And I often say that, you know, the thing that unites us is a recognition that we have to stop treating people and planet like they're here to serve the economy and start treating the economy like it's here to serve us, right? And so that sort of shift just in terms of our understanding of the economy is what, connects us, even if there are a lot of different strategies and approaches for getting there. We feel like they all hold a piece of that puzzle of that different sort of economic system. And so our aim, we're not a think tank, you know, so my role as the economics and policy lead is one, to make accessible these ideas, right? So because often they're there's a lot of our academic jargon, or they're within like, technical sort of like white papers or different sort of things. And so how do we synthesize and make accessible these examples and concepts for people, but then also to feed new narratives that move us beyond critique of the current system to really envisioning a positive alternative vision and system towards which to work, because we feel that that's really important for hope and galvanizing the movement. And this is sort of our theory of change, is that can then really feed a social movement of millions of like hearts and minds of people, from the climate movement, from, the racial justice, gender equality, of organizations that are working in all of these different areas that recognize they're trying to just put Band-Aids on the system. And if we can get to the root causes and connect across our various agendas, that we could build the sort of momentum that's needed to push for that change. And so a lot of it is like grassroots in this sense that we have place-based hubs. So hubs like in Scotland or California or, Spain or like Argentina, where it just has to be multi-stakeholder. So people from academia and government and business and civil society come together and really try to advocate for the kind of reforms that make sense for their context. But we also have global initiatives like the Wellbeing Economy Governments, which is a group of governments which are all committed to different notions of progress and trying to really connect and exchange with one another to put that transformation into action. And so currently that's Finland, Iceland, New Zealand, Scotland, Wales, and Canada just joined. And so it's an informal partnership, but they've all developed alternative indicators to GDP, and they're now trying to really figure out how to transform their economic systems in line with it. And so we're trying to take like a multi sort of tiered approach, but also wherever there seems to be energy and momentum to sort of be in service of that. Recognizing that the conceptual purity matters much less than the idea resonating with people and an inspiring action in that direction.
What would you say are the most important policy changes that need to happen first, according to you? Like, what are the first steps?
So I already sort of touched on this a little bit, but for me personally, I really do think that like global competition legislation is really kind of step one, because it's just too much power is consolidated within the hands of a very few select group of shareholders and corporations and investors. And so, the economic system is ultimately a social system, which is also a system of power. And so in order to even make space for meaningful participation and governance of the economy, we need to disperse that power. And so starting with some global competition legislation feels like it will make a lot of other legislation a lot more possible to actually even achieve, because you'll be breaking that up in some way. And so that for me is like just a personal, I think, really important first step in terms of political capture and sort of feasibility. And then from there, I do feel like we need to really, there's participatory sort of governance reform has to come alongside the economic systems reform. And we're seeing this, and we're seeing it in action, because I was speaking with this woman who works, I don't remember what the name of their department is exactly, but it's around like political participation or democracy. And she was talking about, they did a study of 50 years of different kind of participatory democratic initiatives across their countries. And there were some, and she said the last like 2-3 years, it's been like exponential. There's been tons and tons and tons more of just civil society demand for having a voice. And I think these things are very interlinked, because the shape and form of globalization has made us feel like we don't have a lot of agency over our livelihoods, and especially over the economy. That's always presented as the most important thing, and the thing that we aren't allowed to have any sort of say over. And so building those democratic reforms at the local and the national and the global level in order to, then facilitate a process of thinking through what kind of alternative economic policies are needed seems really important.
What can you do maybe as a regular citizen to be engaged in some way, like that you can change even on the local perspective or something. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, so obviously for us, like, first and foremost, it'd be great to join WEAll as a member, as an individual. It's, for me at least personally, you know, I've worked in economic policy for a really long time, and it can feel really difficult to, and like you're alone when you think about these ideas, and when you recognize that there's like all of these fundamental issues and you're just making marginal change, or you feel stuck in the current sort of system. And so even just having a space like WEAll, which is a global network of individuals and organizations where you can come together and connect with like-minded individuals, for me has felt like incredibly liberating. I feel like I can be much more my like authentic self, like, and also share radical ideas, and people want to think outside the box. And it also just has a self-selection bias of being like pretty cool people. I mean, there's a couple egos always, but you know, mostly like pretty nice people. And you know, so that's a global network, but even at the local level, you can find people who are engaged in your space and build like a WEAll hub, which can really push for these, like, step one is just talking about the economy, right? And demystifying the economy, encouraging people like to feel like they have their lived experience, their common sense has a place in this sphere and in these discussions, because I feel like that's step one. And then expand it once you have opened people's minds to really even consider what the economy is or can be, then you can really start to advocate for a different vision for it, and bringing together different people to the table to realize that they all have something, a part to play in sharing their passions and their gifts as part of that sort of transformation. And then, you know, beyond, you know, sort of the place-based hubs and the sort of global movement, I would say maybe final thing is, yeah, I guess it's related to those passions. Like, I genuinely believe that everybody is here for a reason, you know, and I think we all have a really unique gift that we're meant to share with the world. And it's about, yeah, just finding ways in which to tap into that, to connect with one another, be more generous, spend more time in nature, you know, like all of those things I think will be really good for ourselves and for the well-being of everyone. Mm-hmm.